Hello and welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to the MMA Girl podcast. This is episode 21 of the MMA Girl podcast, and I'm your host, Jess, the MMA Girl. As usual, I hope you're all doing well, and welcome back to my MMA space where we talk about MMA and combat sports and all that kind of stuff. Thank you very much for tuning back in, and hello and welcome to the new viewers out there. On today's episode of the MMA Girl podcast, episode 21, we're going over some of the exciting news from the MMA world as we know it. We'll be covering Ilia Topuria, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Max Holloway, dirty boxing, Usyk, Ben Askren, Dan Hooker, Gilbert Burns, and all that in between. Of course, we're going over the latest fight announcements that have been made for the coming months. Let's get into it. Ilia Topuria is a very picky UFC champion. Of course, he just got his UFC lightweight belt against Charles Oliveira just a month ago. And since then, of course, he's been called out by everyone in between in the UFC's lightweight division, especially, of course, Arman Tsarukyan, for good cause. Arman Tsarukyan is currently UFC's lightweight #1 contender for the next title shot. But, of course, he's being overlooked once again. And Ilia Topuria just did a live stream with the Nelk Boys. I'm not sure why he did that, but anyway. And he explained to the Nelk Boys, sat around a table eating dinner, that he would not accept a fight from Arman Tsarukyan. He knows for a fact, and we know this as well, that the next title fight will not be against Arman Tsarukyan because, of course, the rumours are swirling between Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway 2, or Paddy Pimblett to be a fun, money-making fight. It's the fight to make on paper when you look at the scenario, when you look at the bad blood between Ilia and Paddy. But, of course, there are other people that deserve a title shot before Paddy and Ilia meet in the octagon. But Arman Tsarukyan is being completely overlooked from A to Z, and Ilia says that he does not want to fight Arman Tsarukyan even after he fights this year or next year. And he says that if the UFC offer him a bout against Arman Tsarukyan for the belt, he would be prepared to relinquish his lightweight belt instead of fighting Arman Tsarukyan. Now, we know that Ilia Topuria is not one to shy away from relinquishing belts, and of course he wants to fight Islam Makhachev as soon as possible. And if Islam Makhachev and Jack Della Maddalena happens this year or early next year and Islam becomes welterweight champion, then Ilia has already shown interest in a fight against Islam Makhachev for that title, to be 3-time champion, 3-division champion. Whether or not Dana White is okay with that is another story, because apparently Dana White does not want anyone to become 3-division champion. But I think Dana White wants people to stick to 2-division championships or just your own division champion, not 3-division champions. But I think that Ilia Topuria is in a world of his own and seems to be able to do what he wants. So him relinquishing the featherweight belt to move up to lightweight, of course, the first thing we thought about was the fact that he hadn't really faced everyone in the featherweight division that could have been an issue for him. But of course, weight cutting was an issue, so he preferred moving up to lightweight, which is completely understandable, as for Max Holloway. But then, of course, dictating who he fights when the #1 contender is and has always been Arman Tsarukyan, even before Ilia was champion and Charles got a shot. So I personally believe the next person for a title shot should, of course, be Arman Tsarukyan. But as he says, Ilia Topuria will not fight Arman Tsarukyan for love nor money. And speaking of which, Arman Tsarukyan just, of course, he's always trolling on the internet, and I love that about Arman Tsarukyan. He's not one to shy away from trolling his future opponents, but he absolutely, undoubtedly wants this fight against Ilia Topuria, which is completely normal because he is #1 contender and he wants to have UFC's gold wrapped around his waist at some point. He's doing this because he loves the sport, not because he needs the money. But he has proposed, let me just get up the stats so you guys can listen to this craziness. Like, basically, he's offered various money/car related bribes to Ilia in order for him to accept a title fight. And he has apparently offered $1 million and any car he wants. Plus, he just said that if Ilia fights Arman and Arman loses, Arman will pay for Ilia $500K. And that's more of a betting situation, because if Arman wins against Ilia Topuria, Ilia then has to give him $500K. Now, I think Arman, unfortunately, he's getting a bit overzealous because your fight's not even confirmed. The UFC are not showing any interest in using you in a title fight anytime soon. The next fight he'll be getting, according to Ilia Topuria, will just be another fight for a spot in lightweight division, or just to keep him active as much as possible, because we haven't seen him since UFC 300, when of course he got a split decision victory over Charles Oliveira, which goes to show how long it's been since we see him in the octagon. Of course, we saw him twice in submission fights, one at Karate Combat and one at ADXC10, where he got a win over Patricky Pitbull via submission, and he won, of course, in a submission pit match at Karate Combat against Zainakov, also someone who comes out of Khabib's camp. So Arman, you've been away for a while. More than a year has gone by since you fought. You're going to have to accept a fight now, whether it's not for the fight title or whether it is for the title. A fight is going to have to be booked for Arman Tsarukyan this year, because not seeing him active all year has been very hard to see, seeing as he is number one contender. He is, of course, using his time wisely, helping Chimaev with his camp for UFC 319, which is very, very, very soon. But in the meantime, he needs to think also about his career and his position in the UFC. We'll see where that goes. But of course, Ilia Topuria, being Ilia Topuria, he sets the rules down, and he has dictated that he won't be fighting Arman Tsarukyan at least anytime soon. I think that UFC could persuade him to fight Arman next year, for example, if Arman gets a fight in the lightweight division in the next few months. I think that's possible, because they were able to persuade a lot of people to fight other people. Just some people, like John Jones, unfortunately, were just unpersuadable. But I think there is a way to get him to fight Arman at some point, because that is the fight we need to see. Anyway, one thing that Ilia did say was that he would like to be... He's obviously following in the footsteps of Conor McGregor in some sorts, and we've seen a lot of similarities between them. He probably idolised Conor McGregor when he was younger, but of course now Ilia has completely separated himself from Conor because of all of Conor's tomfoolery, as I like to say. But one thing that he does want to follow in the footsteps of Conor for is the fact that he could one day be in a boxing exhibition match like Conor did against Mayweather. And he was saying he'd be interested in fighting the winner between Crawford and Canelo, which of course is happening on September 13th, which could be crazy. I mean, I don't think the UFC would be against that, because of course it's Dana White who is promoting Crawford versus Canelo, and Dana White's getting into boxing with Turki Al-Sheikh actively. This could be the best way to get a crossover fight to happen easily, compared to how it was for Conor versus Mayweather. Of course, Conor versus Mayweather was a huge money fight, so Dana White didn't say no. But a lot of other fighters that have tried to do cross-promotion fighting in big fights like this have been refused. So if anyone was going to get an exhibition fight in boxing and be able to keep their UFC contract going, I think Ilia Topuria would be the best candidate for that. And this is the best time to be a UFC fighter wanting an exhibition fight in boxing, because Dana White is getting into boxing right now. So that's huge. And I would be very up to seeing... I mean, Crawford versus Ilia, amazing. But Canelo versus Ilia Topuria, I would love to see that. I would love that so much. But anyway, let's not get carried away, because maybe it won't happen. But for now, that is what Ilia is wanting. And we all know that sometimes, most of the time, Ilia gets what he wants. We're going to stay in the lightweight division now, of course. We're going to talk about Max Holloway. Just a little side note. Max Holloway, after his fight against Dustin Poirier 2 weeks ago now at UFC 318, he has achieved a record in the UFC that goes across all weight divisions, because he has achieved the record of the most significant strikes ever of any UFC fighter in the history of UFC. Over the whole entirety of his career, he has achieved 3,500 significant strikes in his career up until now. And of course, the record will be upheld by Max Holloway as soon as he goes back into the octagon and fights someone else, because no one comes close to touching his record of the most significant strikes in UFC history, which is insane, coming from someone who is still very young. He's been in the UFC for quite some time. So this is what gives him that longevity, that experience. And of course, he's able to break records at the UFC, having been there for so long. He's been at the UFC for more than 12 years now. But it's still a huge achievement for Max Holloway. And it just goes to show his speed and agility in striking is unmatched, honestly. I saw Chael Sonnen tweet out that he would like to see Paddy Pimblett versus Max Holloway. And I must admit that hearing that matchup, I would love to see that as well. I mean, if we don't see Paddy Pimblett versus Ilia Topuria next, I think we'll probably see Ilia Topuria versus Gaethje, if I'm honest, this year or start of next year. But if we see Ilia versus Gaethje in November, December or January, and we're looking for something to do with Paddy Pimblett and Max Holloway, why not put them in a fight together? Of course, Charles Oliveira is on the table as well. We may be able to see a Paddy Pimblett Charles Oliveira or a Max Holloway Charles Oliveira. But I would love to see a Max Holloway Paddy Pimblett at some point, because those guys in the octagon will be insane. Paddy, of course, being a heavier grappler than Max Holloway. Max will have to obviously work around his grappling. He's a good grappler, Max. I'm not saying the opposite, but of course he's a striker at heart, and so he'd have to really work a little bit more on his grappling to be at the height to beat Paddy Pimblett in an octagon. But I'd love to see that fight go down, honestly. So let's go on to Dan Hooker, staying in the lightweight division, because Dan Hooker has just woken up and called out not only Charles Oliveira, but also Arman Tsarukyan on Twitter, on X. And he said, for word, Daddy's home, and that Charles Oliveira, someone wake up Charles Olives, I'm coming. He would love a fight against Charles Oliveira. And I think most people would love to see Dan Hooker against anyone in the top 5 of the lightweight division, including myself. And a fight between Charles Oliveira and Dan Hooker would be insane. And of course, he's also called out Arman Tsarukyan, calling him a bitch, saying, you're going to get it too, Daddy's home, to Arman. So maybe that would be the best proposition for Arman right now, because no one else is calling out Arman Tsarukyan. And you know the UFC like when you open your mouth and you call out your future opponents, because that creates that storyline, even though it's a little storyline right now. He's already insulted Arman on Twitter, which would be a great way to segue into a fight. So seeing Charles Oliveira versus Paddy Pimblett or Charles Oliveira versus Max Holloway, we could also see Dan Hooker versus Arman Tsarukyan for the number 1 contender spot. And if Dan Hooker gets the win over Arman Tsarukyan, then I think Ilia Topuria would stay at lightweight a lot longer, because he'd be more than happy, I think, to fight Dan Hooker rather than Arman. But is Ilia Topuria ducking Arman Tsarukyan, or is he really just afraid that he'll pull out of this fight again, which is what I'm sort of asking myself, because I do find it ridiculous to deny someone a chance at your belt when they're number 1 contender. But the UFC, they're allowing duckers to continue ducking, so he will continue to duck, as they say. Dirty boxing, on another note, dirty boxing. If you guys don't know what dirty boxing is, I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. It is Mike Perry's dirty boxing promotion, endorsed by none other than John Jones, of course. We've seen 2 major events come out of Dirty Boxing 1 and Dirty Boxing 2. And now we have Dirty Boxing 3 coming up on the 29th of August in Miami. Now, this happening in Miami, Florida is a great way to end summer, have a nice main event between 2 massive, huge heavyweights. Of course, Rosenstrike, coming off of his win at the last Dirty Boxing main event over his dangerous opponent, he is coming into another main event at Dirty Boxing with another huge, scary opponent called The Wolf. His name, of course, is Robinson Perez, and he has a record of 3 victories and 3 losses on his current professional boxing record. Now, he's coming into Dirty Boxing. He just signed his contract, as I talked to you about that last week, and he'll be taking on Rosenstrike in Dirty Boxing's next main event at Dirty Boxing 3. So these guys will be having it on in the ring at Dirty Boxing's August 29th event, Dirty Boxing 3. And I suggest to any guys who are looking to watch other promotions, get into Dirty Boxing. They have a few events. They have 2 events that are already available to watch. I think 3 on YouTube, as far as I know. And Dirty Boxing's 3rd event is happening at the end of next month. So I recommend you check it out. It should be cool. The UFC White House event is, of course, coming up next year for July the 4th, Independence Day, and the celebration of 250 years of the United States of America. And of course, as you guys know, Dana White and Donald Trump have discussed the idea of doing a UFC event at the White House, which is going to be actively planned and executed as far as we know for now. We've had a lot of rumors flying about what fights we could be seeing at the White House, but apparently in the works, we may be getting Jamal Hill on the prelim card for the White House card, facing none other than Andrew Tate. I never thought I'd ever see Andrew Tate at the UFC, but if that's true, then I think that this will be a kind of card where we see crossovers, a lot of crossovers, because it being a White House card, it has to be explosive, it has to be a pay-per-view, it has to make millions and millions and millions of dollars. And in order for that to make millions, then people like former champions like Jamal Hill may be on the prelims, and that's not a surprise to me at all. And seeing Andrew Tate on this card makes me believe that we may be seeing not every opponent for a UFC fighter, but some UFC fighters take on opponents from other promotions or UFC fighters coming and signing a one-off deal with the UFC for the UFC's White House card. Now, that could be very interesting. And also on the table is, of course, an offer from PFL, because PFL, having heard of the news that the UFC are coming to the White House next year for Independence Day, have also offered to allow some of their fighters to come and fight on UFC's White House card. Don Davis, the founder of PFL, has tagged Donald Trump on Twitter on a couple of occasions, saying he would be willing to give over his fighters, like, for example, Usman Nurmagomedov, Chris Cyborg, and Francis Ngannou, of course, for a major UFC/PFL event at the White House. This could open a door to see John Jones versus Francis Ngannou. We may finally be able to say who is the best heavyweight in the world and put those two guys in an octagon together. And I think for the right money, John Jones would fight anybody. So I honestly believe seeing Ngannou and John Jones in the octagon at UFC's White House card would not be unlikely if the deal was done correctly with the PFL as well. So that's the news on the White House card, and I can't wait to see any of the fights that are announced for that, but we will have to wait quite a while, I think, for those fights to be announced. But at least we know that the UFC, of course, are working hard on that card, and we may be seeing some PFL fighters at the UFC's White House event. Or maybe Dana might say to Donald Trump, no, either you do the event with me or I'll just do something else, because I don't want any crossover, cross promotion fights at my UFC White House event. That may be what Dana says. Who knows? Gilbert Burns recently called out someone who I didn't expect him to call out, but I was very surprised and happy to hear. He called out Daniel Rodriguez for a fight in the coming months. He's talking December, January time, because he doesn't know when his concussion protocol allows him to fight, at what point he is allowed to fight, because of course he got knocked out recently by Morales in an Apex event that was shocking, but Morales is on a steamrolling effect. So Gilbert Burns, of course, was collateral damage on that road. But anyway, I am going to insert a clip here of me saying what fights to make after UFC 318. And why not put Daniel Rodriguez against either a Gilbert Burns or a Vicente Luque, both guys coming off of huge KO losses and needing a tune-up, I think, from someone like Daniel Rodriguez, who got his tune-up a couple of fights ago. So I'd love to see that happen between Daniel Rodriguez and either Gilbert Burns or Vicente Luque, because Daniel Rodriguez, of course, won his fight over Kevin Holland via unanimous decision at UFC 318. It was a great fight, and I said that he should probably take on Gilbert Burns or Vicente Luque, two Brazilian fighters who were recently knocked out in their last bouts and looking for a tune-up. And lo and behold, Gilbert Burns has called out Daniel Rodriguez. Now, I'm not saying he watched my podcast or listened to any of my podcasts, but it's just a great coincidence when I hear random fighters calling out fighters I suggested they fight when it really wasn't on the cards. Like, Daniel Rodriguez is on a 3-fight win streak, so why not? And Gilbert Burns called him out, so I'm very happy about that. So maybe in January, December time, we'll be seeing Gilbert Burns versus Daniel Rodriguez, because as I said early on in this podcast, the UFC love when you call out your next opponents. They love finishing the storylines, and that could be a great storyline, I think. I'd love to see that. Khabib Nurmagomedov has made a statement recently that has shocked most people, but it could be an idea that will be adopted by the UFC one day, or maybe just any MMA promotion at some point, or a new MMA promotion may pop up at some point with this idea in place. Khabib has said that he doesn't understand the idea of rounds. He doesn't see why the rounds are necessary. He thinks that if the fight is a 3-rounder, then the fight should just have a 15-minute time limit, and then throw both fighters into the octagon and wait 15 minutes and stop the fight, of course, when the fight is stopped. Same goes for when it's a title fight. Instead of doing 5 rounds, he says put the fighters in the octagon for 25 minutes and lock the door. No breaks, no pauses, no rounds. Now, this could be a good idea for a new promotion, as I said to you guys. Like, for example, Mike Perry's Dirty Boxing. The rules in Dirty Boxing, I wouldn't be able to say them verbatim, but some of the rules of Dirty Boxing are not rules that we see in classic boxing fights, because Mike Perry has switched it up and remixed some of the rules in his way. Now, this could be a great idea for a new MMA promotion that wants to do a variation on the rules in MMA. But seeing as every round seems to be important to tune your fighters up, get them in the corner, get them hydrated, rested, even though it's a minute, it will just the difference it makes for some fighters is huge. And I don't see the UFC or any big MMA promotion like PFL or anyone like that actually removing the round system, as it's something that maybe, I'm not sure, but it may be something that's obligatory according to any athletic commissions. So for now, I'm not sure of that. But of course, we're obviously hearing that Khabib is wanting to scrap all rounds. So that could be an idea one day that could be adopted by another promotion, at least. On another subject, before I go on to the fight announcements, Alexander Usyk, who recently, of course, defeated Daniel Dubois for the undisputed heavyweight championship belts in Wembley in London, has been ordered by the WBO to face Joseph Parker, who is interim champ, of course, when, of course, Usyk last relinquished his belt. Joseph Parker became interim champ, and now, of course, the WBO is evidently ordering the fight to happen between Usyk and Joseph Parker. Now, he has until the 23rd of August to respond to this request by the WBO, and after that date, he will have to relinquish his belt and put it on the line and possibly make Joseph Parker the undisputed heavyweight champ. And I'm not sure he'd be willing to do that because, of course, there are a lot of possibilities on the cards for Alexander Usyk. For example, a fight against the newly unretired Tyson Fury, who says that he would only fight Usyk if he were to come back to boxing, but he is officially unretired. Or we may see Usyk versus Anthony Joshua 3, or we may wait until Dubois wants his third fight as well. He has a few trilogies he could finish off in the WBO, but I think the best fight to do is for the interim belt to unify the two belts and make sure that Joseph Parker, if he wins against Usyk, gets his flowers as well. That's the fight to make, and I hope they do make it, and he will hopefully accept the offer and not relinquish his belt again for them to come back and get it back. I wouldn't like to see that again. Honestly, I wouldn't. So the UFC 319 co-main event is official between Aaron Pico, of course, making his UFC debut at UFC 319 in August. Obviously, headline, we have Chimaev versus Duplessis for the UFC's middleweight belt. And he'll be taking on Leon Murphy, number 4 ranked featherweight contender in the world at the UFC. Now, this comes off, of course, the cancellation of Musa Evloev versus Aaron Pico, which was supposed to happen on Saturday at UFC Abu Dhabi. And now we have Aaron Pico making his debut against Leon Murphy. I think it's a great matchup, and Leon Murphy's a real gangster for accepting a fight on a few weeks' notice. Love that for him, and I think on a few weeks' notice, that's the best option for you to go for, is with someone who's never been seen in the UFC before. He's got a bit of time to prepare for him, but I just like this matchup. A lot of people are complaining about it, saying it's not a good co-main event, but I think it's going to be a great co-main, and I think the UFC 319 card is stacked. Go check it out. Let me know what you think of Leon Murphy versus Aaron Pico. But I think it's a great test for Leon Murphy and also a great test for Aaron Pico, having said that he is championship-worthy talent in the UFC and will be shocked when we see him first fight with the UFC. So I can't wait to see Aaron Pico versus Leon Murphy happening in a couple of weeks at UFC 319. At UFC Noche, of course, headline, we have Diego Lopez versus John Silva, the fighting nerd. That would be an insane fight. And we have had Tatiana Suarez versus Lemos added to this fight card. I'm not sure exactly on what position, main card or prelim card, but Tatiana Suarez versus Lemos is happening at UFC Noche. That's a cool fight that's been added to this card. And I can't wait to see Tatiana Suarez come back. We've not seen her in a while. At UFC 320, we may be getting Alexander Topuria, of course, Ilia Topuria's older brother, who had made his UFC debut last year. And he's coming back, apparently, to face Malcolm Wellmaker at UFC 320 in Vegas at T-Mobile Arena. Now, of course, headline this card in October 4th, we have none other than Ankalaev versus Alex Pereira. And in this fight card, we also have Merab Dvalishvili versus Corey Sandhagen. And we have Khalil Rountree versus Jiri Prochazka. So we have quite a few huge high-caliber fights on this card. And I think Alexander Topuria versus Wellmaker would be a great addition to the main card. But it could be a featured prelim on the prelims card as well. Not sure what the UFC plan on doing with that fight yet. But that is the targeted fight for UFC 320. Can't wait for that. At UFC 321, just a little announcement that makes me giggle a little bit. We have Hamdi Abdullahib. We saw him last compete at UFC's Abu Dhabi card in December, where we also saw Chris Barnett injure himself whilst getting himself pumped up for his fight. And it was really hard to see Chris Barnett get completely mauled by Jakuru, just because he'd, of course, injured an ankle whilst, celebrating the start of his fight, which is completely crazy and a really stupid injury. But of course, stupid injuries do happen in MMA, as they would do in any sport. But Chris will be back against Abdul Wahab in the main event, not at all, at UFC 321. Of course, at UFC 21 we have Tom Aspinall versus Cyril Gane headlining, and we also have Volkov versus Almeida happening for the number one contender spot at the heavyweight division. So we have another heavyweight bout added to this card. So UFC 321 is heavyweights in this fight card, and it will shake up the UFC's heavyweight division as we know it. So it did need a shake-up anyway. So we've got a few heavyweight bouts. Not really sure, with 3 heavyweight bouts on the UFC 321's card. Not really sure if we'll get any other heavyweight bouts, but we may do. With maybe a huge shake-up for the heavyweight division. And I'm excited to hear what fights are going to be coming up next for UFC 321 as well. In the works also for UFC Vancouver happening on October 18th, we may be getting Umar Nurmagomedov versus Mario Bautista. Mario Bautista obviously coming off of a win against Patchy Mix. He made his debut at UFC 317. Didn't go as well as he planned it to. Mario Bautista came out with the unanimous decision. Great victory for Mario. And we're putting up against potentially Umar Nurmagomedov at a UFC Vancouver event in a 5-round main event on October 18th. This has not been confirmed yet. This is obviously in the works. And when we say in the works, we mean targeted. And when we say targeted, we mean alleged. It could not happen, but I hope and think it will happen. We'll see what happens next. And stay tuned, of course, for any of Dana White's updates on that one. So that is everything we have for you in terms of latest news, latest fight announcements, latest fight rumors. Anyway, that's the latest news on that one.